Hello. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us here this evening, both all of you here in person in the shul, and we have people on the stream, so welcome to everybody. Unfortunately, our chairman, Ian Mann, was unable to be here this evening, so I'm standing in for him. And I just need to make a warm welcome to our new rabbi, Rabbi Shimon, who's just arrived. No, Rabbi, I can point. Who's just arrived from Europe, and we're so thrilled. He came with his mother, and we're very excited to have him here. So the reason you're here. We're very honored to welcome Adam Golding, who is a very well-known musician and conductor of two groups, the African Renaissance Ensemble and the Lewandowski Chorale. We approached Adam to give this talk to our ITJ conversion students, and he very kindly agreed to do this. And because it's such an interesting topic, we decided to open it further and to all the congregants. So thank you for being here. I think it's a very interesting subject. Jewish shul music is something we don't really know that much about. And of course, Adam is extremely knowledgeable on this subject, and he will be giving us an insight into the history of Jewish liturgical music and cantorial singing. So I'll hand you over to Adam.
Thank you so much, Glynis, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me, and great to see a few faces here and that there's still some people online. As Glynis said, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the history of Jewish music, focusing on the shul music, liturgical music. And obviously there is a huge amount to this topic, so I'm going to be focusing really on the birth of shul music, and particularly choral shul music, which became a massive tradition in shuls across Europe, a huge tradition here in Southern Africa, in Canada and the United States, and even a very big tradition in Australia. So before we talk about shul music, we need to go back to, we're going to start today's story in the 16th century, and I'm going to play something for you, and then we'll talk about that. Now, you may be wondering about this piece of music. Deus in adjutorium meum intende, Domini ad adjuvandum me festina. It doesn't sound like Jewish music. In Latin, you would be correct in guessing that it was written for the Catholic Church. However, it comes from Psalm 69, O God, come to my assistance, O Lord, make haste to help me. And it really is here that the birth of Jewish choral music happens. Now, to see how we get here to Monteverdi's Vespers for the Virgin Mary and what that has to do with shul music, we need to go back a little bit. So, my introduction to synagogue music. We go back to Florence and the Renaissance. In the year 1402, the Florence Cathedral that you can see probably on the right, I don't know if the screen's flipped, on the left, was being built, and it had stood for 100 years without a dome. You can see that beautiful brick dome. It's the biggest dome ever built out of bricks to this day, and no one knew how to build it at the time. And across the road was the baptistry, and a competition went out to who could design the gates for this baptistry that would face this church. And the two artists that competed were named Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. And the competition went out, and Ghiberti won. He created this, which became known as the Golden Gate of Paradise. And it is with this that the Renaissance begins. Brunelleschi goes into a bit of depression. He goes to Rome, and for 20 years studies the Pantheon, the great dome built by the Romans 1,500 years earlier. And he comes back and says, I know how to finish the dome on this church. Just bearing in mind, without a dome, it had been raining into the church for 100 years. There was literally no cover. There was no roof there because no one knew what to do. And he did it. And he did another thing. He resurrected the idea of drawing in linear perspective, the idea of a vanishing point. He created a drawing of the baptistry and tried to one-up Ghiberti, and he displayed it in an ingenious way. He asked that instead of looking at his painting in linear perspective, he held it backwards on the stairs of the Duomo, the cathedral, and asked viewers to look through a hole in the middle of the painting at a mirror. They thought that they were looking at the real thing, and then he would remove it, and it was really revelationary for those who saw it. Then in 1453, Constantinople was sacked by the Ottomans, and a huge number of Greek intellectuals went back into Europe and brought with them so much of the Renaissance, or so much of Greek and Roman culture, and that was kind of the second start of the Renaissance. The Renaissance meaning rebirth, and this rebirth of culture. And at the end of the Renaissance, in around the 1570s, the Count di Bardi of Florence assembles a group of musicians, poets, humanists, and he asks them to investigate and to bring what they can from these ancient cultures. And they decide that they want to resurrect the idea of a Greek play as it was originally done. And one of the things that was so important in Greek theater, which hadn't been performed in well over 1,500 years, was the idea that there was music and dance as part of the play. And this group, the Florentine Camerata, as they called themselves, started to perform these tragedies and comedies, and it led to the invention of opera. And this invention of opera coincided very much with the end of the Renaissance and the start of the next period, which was the Baroque period, which is dated in architecture, art, and music, usually to the year 1600. And it was in the Baroque that so much of what we know as music today came to be. Things like major and minor scales developed over the course of the Baroque period. The notation that we use developed over the Baroque period. The idea of even indicating what instruments should play what part developed over the Baroque period. And it was composers who transitioned this period from the Renaissance to the Baroque that we have to thank for the advent of Jewish choral music. So we're going to go back a little bit again to the year 70-71 AD with the Roman destruction of the Jewish Second Temple. The Romans destroyed the temple, and after that there was an edict that Jews shouldn't have music, at least not in synagogues, for 1,000 years. After that, it seemed that what might be called a Baal Tefillah, or a cantor that would lead the service, would sing on his own and would lead the service, but there was certainly no such thing as people singing together. And this continued for the next 500 years until where we are now in our story. We're going to jump forward to the Gonzaga court in Mantua. Italy at the time didn't exist as a country. It was a series of city-states, each of them ruled by powerful merchant families. And Mantua was a major, major city at the time, as major as somewhere like Florence, Milan, and it was ruled by this Gonzaga family. And the Gonzaga family at the time were massive patrons of the arts and of music. This is Mantua as it looks today. All the photographs I've used in this presentation are my own, and I've really tried to go to all of these places to experience what it must have been like at the time. And Francesco, Ferdinando, and Vincenzo were the rulers. Vincenzo particularly brought in a huge amount of music, and he employed a number of court composers and gave them access to funds and orchestras and commissioned operas and various other works. And it takes us back to where we started, to Claudio Monteverdi. Monteverdi came from Cremona to Mantua, and there he started to write and create the Baroque period of music. But he didn't do this alone. He worked with other composers, and he is the guy who wrote the first operas that are still performed today, written as early as 1607 with L'Orfeo. I'm not going to play this for you now because we want to get onto some Jewish music. And it takes us to one of his contemporaries, Salomone Rossi. Anyone here heard of Claudio Monteverdi before? Heard the name? Okay, he's a major composer and still very famous amongst classical music listeners. Rossi, not so much. But at the time, Rossi was as respected as Monteverdi. Rossi lived in Mantua, and there had been a huge resurgence of Jewish culture during the Renaissance in Italy at the time as well. However, towards the end of the Renaissance, edicts were laid against the Jews that they had to start living in ghettos. They had very restricted areas of each city where they were allowed to reside, and they had to wear a mark on their clothing to show that they were Jewish. This could be a red star on their cap. It could have even been a yellow armband, orange thing on their pockets. And Rossi was so respected as a composer that he was given permission not to wear these signs and to live wherever he wanted. He was given freedom of the city and made a full citizen. He also had a sister called Madame Europa, who was one of the first opera stars, and she was supposedly a major, major celebrity. There's quite a lot of conspiracy, and there's some conspiracists who think that Madame Europa actually wasn't his sister, but was actually Rossi himself, which is not that far-fetched because many of the opera stars at the time were castrati or countertenors were males who sang very high-pitched voice. Now, Rossi pioneered some of the forms of instrumental music that became seminal in the Baroque period, the trio sonata. He was also the first to set madrigals to instrumental bass lines. But let's listen to a little bit of his instrumental music to give you an idea of what the music sounded like at the time. The music at this time predated the idea of chords. Everything was written as multiple melodies that intertwined. If you listen to the violin recorder, they each have their own very independent and primary melody. And the composer would think not about chord, but about the intervals between every note. And there were so many rules that they had to follow, because not only was it about the aesthetics of the music, but doing something wrong was an affront against nature, science, and God himself. Something a little bit different. This is a dance form called the brando. We know that Rossi was not only a great composer, but also an incredibly talented violinist and also singer. He would have even played violin in the premieres of some of the first operas ever written, including L'Orfeo, the first opera ever written that's still performed today. Now, I spoke earlier about the idea of a madrigal. A madrigal was a secular song, usually sung by a number of people, and I'm going to play you a madrigal by Monteverdi, performed here by a group of, some of these are very close friends of mine, the Profeti della Quinta, who have done some of the most research into the performance practices of Salamone Rossi. So a vocal madrigal by Monteverdi. At the time, this massive lute instrument, the theorbo, was created to accompany vocalists. We're very lucky to have one in our ensemble. This is actually a very, very small theorbo, believe it or not. Now, Rossi also composed madrigals, many of which have been forgotten, but I think that they are parallel of Monteverdi's, equally beautiful, if not more so, some of the most beautiful secular music from the time. And I'll play you a little excerpt of each of these. The first one was sung in some concerts of ours by Glynis once upon a time a few years ago, and hopefully she'll sing it again with us. Cor mio, my heart. Again, you can hear all of those melodies intertwining with each other. And one more, udite lacrimosi spiriti. So, oh, sorry. This gives you a setting of what music sounded like at the time, what people were writing, both in the church and in secular setting. And we now move to the city of Ferrara. Ferrara is another one of those major city-states in Italy that we don't really think of as that major anymore, ruled by the Este families. This is the castle of Ferrara, which is set in the middle of the town square, surrounded by this moat. A truly incredible thing to see. And Ferrara had a flourishing Jewish community as well, and Rabbi Judah Aryeh of Modena came to Ferrara from Modena, and he wanted to pioneer this idea of music being brought back into the synagogue. He heard about this young composer and cantor Salamone Rossi, who was working, a day or so's carriage ride away from Ferrara, and he wrote to him, and they became close friends and correspondents. And he encouraged him to start writing and setting psalms and prayers to music in the style of the day. Now, as I said before, there was Jewish music at the time, in that the cantor would sing in the shul, but it would be by himself. There was no concept of people singing together. And this led to the publication of Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, the Songs of Solomon. This is not the biblical Song of Solomon, but rather Solomon Rossi's idea de pan on his own name, the Songs of me, Solomon. And this is the original publication. It was published in 1623, so it is the 400th anniversary of shul music this year, which is what our concerts are celebrating, our upcoming concerts are celebrating. And you can see what the music looked like at the time. Rossi took the music of his time and started to write shul music. And we're going to listen to some of it now. The first is the Kedusha, the centerpiece of the Amidah, one of the most important prayers in the 3 daily services. And what's also very important is that Rossi not only was the first person to notate shul music, he was the first person to ever notate any music in Hebrew, which is quite a tricky thing to do because music and Hebrew read in opposite directions. And if you look, you can see the words here written in full in the opposite direction. And it is up to the musician to know how that word should be spread over the notes that are written above. There are certain things that are up to interpretation, but so much of it is down to the correct grammatical pronunciation of the word and how the syllables should fall. So I'll play you 2 different recordings of this Kedusha now. The first, again, by the Profeti de la Quinta. This is done at Baroque pitch. Even the idea of the tuning that we use today didn't exist at the time. And then another one which introduces something very interesting that I'll talk about before we get there. Let's have a listen to what the very first shul music ever would have sounded like. You can hear again the intertwining of the melodies, 4 very distinct melodies, each equally important, working together. And the intervals are all calculated that there should be perfect resonance, concord, then dissonance at appropriate points according to the text, which must always resolve perfectly back to the consonants. And we will be singing this piece in the upcoming concert. Now, at this time in the church, it was very common to take old chants, Gregorian chants, and those would be monodies, single melodies that were used and chanted over and over again, that had become very much part of the service, and for composers in the Renaissance and Baroque to write around these. So there would be a chant as a call, and then a choral response. And if you look here on this music, you can see these double bar lines, 1, 2, 3, on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th lines. At the time, there was no such thing as a bar line in music, a line that goes down between the notes. And it seems to indicate that this is where the cantor should insert a chant. So scholar Joshua Jacobson and his choir, the Zamir Chorale in Boston, have put together and reconstructed what these chants in between might sound like. So we'll hear the beginning again, and then a chant in between. chant. I see the rabbi's face thinking it's a very strange Kedusha, some strange words there, but in Italy at the time, we think of Jewish people being divided into Ashkenazi and Sephardi. But there are actually other rites and traditions of liturgy, or Nusach, and one of the oldest is called the Italki, and it dates back to before the destruction of the Second Temple, when there were many Jewish people living in the courts of the first Roman emperors, and even in the last days of the Roman Republic, including the young Herod Agrippa, who grew up in the court of Augustus, and eventually went on to be one of the last kings of Israel, of the kingdom of Israel. And this rite dates back to there. They even had their own language of Italki, which had Hebrew root words with Italian prefixes and suffixes. The only one that I can remember offhand is ganevari, which means to steal, from the Hebrew word of ganef. Okay. This is, I'm going to play you one more piece by Rossi. This is his Kaddish. So, I think the music is absolutely staggering. And I think that one of the only reasons that Rossi isn't as famous as Monteverdi today is that the major method of dissemination of music through the ages is through the church. And if your pieces are being sung as masterpieces in a church like St. Mark's in Venice, where Monteverdi's Vespers were probably premiered, the reach is far. When you're singing to the Jewish community, it's much smaller. And you would imagine that the Jewish community would have been delighted to have music to use in their shuls at the time. But actually, this wasn't the case. There is a written report from a congregant at a shul in Venice just after this, who talks about three men who started singing together. They had the audacity to start singing together in shul. And they were rightly thrown out and told not to come back because it was an affront against the temple and God to sing together in shul. So the music of Rossi the shul music of Rossi wasn't that successful. It may have been sung in concert. We don't know. There are a couple of other accounts of people singing together in harmony in shul, which is almost definitely linked back to this. Rabbi Leon Modena, who I mentioned earlier, did use the music in his shul in Ferrara, but it didn't really take off as Modena and Rossi had hoped. But that's not to say that there was no other Jewish music during the Baroque period. There were at least two other composers, quite a few others actually, who wrote major works in Hebrew, and both of these were not Jewish composers. Carlo Grossi, 1634 to 1688, was commissioned by the Jewish community of Venice to write a piece for the festival of Hoshana Rabbah. Anyone know that festival? Yeah. So Hoshana Rabbah is a minor festival. It is the last day of Sukkot before Shmini Atzeret. It has some very strange rituals attached to it, including walking around the bima with lulav and etrog 7 times. But stranger than that is to take a bundle of willow leaves and literally thrash the living hell out of it. And that is the last of three rituals that are done over Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then Hoshana Rabbah to transfer our sins as a last way of getting rid of them. I suspect it was written for Hoshana Rabbah because, not being a major festival, it's one of the festivals where you're allowed to work. It seems that music would have been more acceptable at a festival like this. So it was written for a soloist with instrumental accompaniment, and then in 4 parts, a very simple choral arrangement that would have been easy enough for the entire chorus to sing. There is actually more to this story, which gets a little bit more interesting, but you're going to have to come to the concerts to hear that part. And it should not be played with piano. It hadn't been invented for another 100 and 200 years. Sung very much in the style of Monteverdi. Grossi was not the major composer that Rossi was, and this is kind of one of his very few works that we still have. Carries on in 4 movements. I think that is a truly, truly dreadful recording, but it's all I had access to. And if you'd like to hear it sung beautifully, you'll have to listen to Doron singing it, where he really does it justice. The next one was Ludovicos Saladan. This is literally the only piece that we have of his. And he was employed by a very wealthy family in Provence in France to compose a 4-movement, full orchestra, 3 soloists and chorus work for the circumcision and bris ceremony of their son. A lot of speculation that this was done to make the ritual more palatable and less strange to what we would imagine would have been the large non-Jewish audience that would have attended. I won't play the whole thing for you. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the piece, I'll jump through it. But it is 12 minutes long, so. And then, okay, it turns out I can't jump through it, but we'll listen to the 3rd movement. What is called Portuguese Synagogue of Amsterdam during the Baroque period also always kept a composer in residence. They called themselves the Portuguese Synagogue, even though they were Spanish, because it was established just after the War of Secession between the Netherlands and the Spanish. So they didn't want to be associated with the Spanish, even though they'd just been expelled from there. And there is a Haggadah from this period for the Pesach Seder, which includes notated songs at the back. The only one that we have left is a song called Ki Lo Na'eh. But we're going to move forward now to the classical period. And right at the end of the Baroque period, we have George Frederick Handel. And he pioneers a style of composition called the oratorio. He starts off, he's a German, he moves to England. It's actually quite an interesting story. He gets leave from the Archduke of Hanover to go to England for 6 months. He is a servant to this Archduke. He goes to England to work for Queen Anne, and then he's like, England's really nice, I'm just going to stay here. So he absconds on his duties, doesn't go back. The Queen dies, and next in line for the throne is a Catholic, but the English Parliament has passed a decree that only a Protestant can come to the throne. So they look to the next person, also a Catholic, next one, also a Catholic. 53rd in line is the first Protestant, who happens to be the Duke of Hanover. So he gets a letter saying, congratulations, you're now the King of England. He's like, okay, great. During his lifetime, he never bothered to learn to speak English, spent less than a fifth of the rest of his life in England, and kept his primary residence in Hanover, but became the king. He moved over there, and Handel was such a great composer that he forgave him and hired him again. Handel was sick of working with the castrati, who were the mega superstars of their day. They would stop in the middle of an opera, and if they didn't like the aria that had been written for them, they'd just sing another one. In the middle of an opera, they'd take an encore and sing another piece of whatever they felt like, whether it was in the story or not. And he'd had enough of this and turned to what he called the oratorio, coming from the word orate, to speak, which generally had a religious text and would be sung very much like an opera, but without the acting. So there wasn't space for the theatrics that were taking place in the operas. The most famous of these is the Messiah and the Hallelujah chorus that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. But the one I'm going to play for you is a chorus from Judah Maccabea, which is a telling of the book of the Maccabees, of books 1, 2, and 3 Maccabees. This See the Conquering Hero Come. I'm sure all of you will be familiar with this tune because it's been used as a Hanukkah song and as a Christmas carol and as an Easter hymn regularly. So very well-known tune. But to give you an idea of the sound of the very late Baroque moving forward to the classical period. Judah Maccabee has just defeated the Assyrian Greeks, and this is his triumphant march, ironically and purposefully in the style of a Roman triumph. Then the next kind of most famous composer of the time is Mozart. This is a name I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and I'm sure you're also familiar with some of his music. But a composer around exactly the same time as Mozart comes around called Lidarti. And Lidarti decides he's going to write an oratorio to the story of Esther. And he decides that he's going to write the whole thing in Hebrew. So he hires a librettist and writes this oratorio, which was performed and is still performed today. There are some performances on YouTube, and I'll play you a little bit of this. And it sounds exactly like Mozart, but in Hebrew. It's really bizarre to hear. Koro Israeli, the chorus of the Israelites. If you weren't concentrating and you were familiar with Mozart opera, it could be one. Not a great one, but still. The coro ufficiale, the official chorus. Or the chorus of the officials. This brings us to the 19th century in Vienna. And this is the time of Franz Schubert. He is one of the great Viennese composers of the time, vocal music and instrumental music, also a great pianist. And at the same time, there is a position in the Schule in Vienna of Oberkantor, chief chazan, chief cantor, and that is Salomon Sulzer. Schubert thought that Sulzer had the most beautiful voice in Vienna and admired him so much as a composer and as a singer that as a birthday present, Schubert wrote a piece of music for him in Hebrew, Psalm 92, Tov Lehodot. I'll play just the intro of this to give you an idea of the sound of And Sulzer was inspired to start writing music for choir to accompany him. It was very much that it was the cantor, the chazan, but in the early 19th century, he hired a choir of professional singers for the synagogue, and they joined him. Ein Kamocha, the liturgy that is said when the Torah is taken out of the ark, performed here by the Vienna Boys Choir in tribute to Salomon Sulzer. I think what's important to note is that none of this music sounds Jewish, except for the Hebrew that is used, because each of these composers was referring back to the music that was being used in the church at the time. Sulzer was very much influenced by the style of music that was popular in the Catholic Church at the time, Rossi in the Italian Church at the time, and this takes us now to Berlin, where choral music really becomes a staple in the Jewish shul services. The Neue Synagogue was built in the 1840s, and it is one of the most exquisite shuls in the world. In fact, I'm not alone in thinking it is still the most beautiful building in the whole of Berlin, which is not that hard, but still, it is a very beautiful building. And the interior is no longer, but the exquisite dome and the facade remain. Interestingly, it's one of the few shuls that wasn't destroyed by the Nazis. And they hired Lewandowski, who was already becoming a big name in Berlin, as their composer. We go back to Felix Mendelssohn, who was a Christian composer of Jewish ancestry. In fact, his grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, was one of the great Jewish philosophers of the 18th century. And he goes to Berlin and becomes this major, major figure there. And he facilitates that Lewandowski can come in from the town where he lives to study music at the conservatory in Berlin as the first Jewish student to be admitted. Lewandowski writes symphonies and organ works, preludes, all sorts of music, and becomes really celebrated in his day. But it's really his shul music that he is remembered for. He wrote so many compositions where the melodies that he wrote have become something that is sung in shuls today as often in unison, things that we think of as going back thousands of years, but actually come from works that he composed. Things like the traditional melody for V'Shamru Yisrael, sung on a Friday night, Bezot HaTorah, when a chapter of the Torah is finished. And these were big choral works. He also made a case that because his synagogue seated 3,000 people, and the idea was not that they had a choir, but that the entire congregation would sing in perfect four-part harmony, that the only way to coordinate this was with the use of an organ. And it became standard in shuls across Europe that organ was used in the shul. This was also very much the time when the first breakaways from Orthodox Judaism were happening, just before the advent of the Reform movement. He belonged to what was called a progressive movement, which is not the same progressive as Beit David, but rather something that was going back to Orthodox from the Reform. So very much a traditional service, but with instruments and things. And the instruments actually made their way into the Orthodox services as well. One of the Hasidic rabbis in Johannesburg who grew up in Copenhagen and Antwerp talks about the shul that he went to as a kid for friends' bar-mitzvahs and things, and remember there being an organ that was used there on Shabbat. So this edict of music being used in the shul had really fallen away from now and was now by now and was now being fully celebrated. And I will play you two pieces of Lewandowski. The first is Enosh, an incredibly beautiful piece that is said as part of the Yahrzeit prayer, the memorial prayer for loved ones who have passed on. It starts with this organ introduction. And again, very much in the style of the church at the time in Berlin being the Lutheran church. But what both of these composers did do is link the choral sections with traditional cantorial lines that had come from the Nusach liturgy that had been passed down. Sorry. Thought I might be able to sneak something in there, but really And now back to the beginning of the story, because the music of Salomone Rossi had been forgotten by this time. It was not being performed at all, especially not the shul music. And it brings us to Samuel Naumburg. Sulzer was in Vienna, Lewandowski was in Berlin, and Naumburg made his way to Strasbourg on the border between France and Germany, and was so respected there that he eventually became the chief cantor in Paris. And he caught the attention of the Baron Edmund James de Rothschild. He's one of the Rothschild banking families, also one of the early Zionists who paid for huge amounts of land that were bought in those early days, and decided that he wanted to research this early music. And he discovered the manuscripts of Salomone Rossi. He asked Naumburg to reuse these melodies and to publish these collections and to research and put together a compendium of music, a history of Jewish liturgical music. Naumburg, as a romantic composer of the time, rewrote these in the style of the day and wrote new compositions based on the melodies of Rossi. But it is thanks to him that we have the music of Salomone Rossi today. It is from here that everything else stems in terms of Israeli shul music, American shul music. Huge amount was written in South Africa, and it became so much a part of shul services around the world. But unfortunately, particularly in Orthodox shuls, it's starting to fall away today. And that many movements of Orthodox are pushing back against this idea of formal choral music in favor of communal singing. So kind of almost going back to what was happening in before 1600. I'm going to end there, but I'm going to take a moment to just tell you about our upcoming concert. So the concert that we'll be presenting in 2 weeks' time, just under 2 weeks' time, 25th of March and the 26th of March. It's a Saturday night and a Sunday afternoon. Celebrate the 400th anniversary of the publication of this music. We present a selection of songs from Rossi's Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, interspersed with a number of Rossi's instrumental pieces, a composition of Monteverdi's, which is one of the most beautiful songs ever written, and then these two massive later Baroque works that I played for you early, the Carlo Grossi and the Saladin, written for Hoshana Rabbah and that Bris ceremony. So it is an unprecedented concert in South Africa. It will be the South African premiere of the Saladin, about 350 years after it was written, and also with all period instruments. So the entire ensemble will be playing on copies of instruments that were used at the time, no modern instruments in the group. And we will be joining the two groups together, the African Renaissance Ensemble and the Lewandowski Chorale. Glynis and Duron will both be singing. I think we have an ensemble of 12 instruments, 6 vocal soloists, and then a choir of almost 20. And it's taking place in the premier music venue in Johannesburg, the brand new Christopher Seabrook Music Hall, which is the only purpose-built chamber music venue in Johannesburg. It was built towards the end of last year, and we're delighted to be one of the first groups performing there. So I really hope that some of you will be able to join us for that concert. Thank you so much for having me. I will go and I will let a piece of music play now to end one more Lewandowski as I say goodbye. So thank you very much. This is regarded as one of Lewandowski's most beautiful pieces, and as far as I know, the only piece that he wrote for only male voices. Everything else was written for mixed choir. This is Zacharti Lach. Thank you very much. I'll let it play in the background.